We've gotten started in an R Markdown file that defines a README HTML file for our data product. And we've got an outline for that file that includes our title and our data entities with the idea that we want to get started with the heart of our data product, which is the data table in this case. Now we could go into our R Markdown code and start typing in information about this data table under this section. But this is where you really want to start thinking about how you want to maintain your metadata over the long run. Now, if you have a process that takes a really long time to run in order to create your data table, then maybe this is the best place to define your metadata because you don't want to have to, if you're tweaking your metadata, you don't want to have to rerun all of that code that generates the data table just for updating the metadata. And this might be the good place to keep track of the metadata because of that. But if that's not a consideration and my data tables don't take very long to generate, I like to keep the code for maintaining my data metadata in the same place where I'm generating the data. And in this case, that's in this processing R Markdown file. In particular, in this section down here where we're writing the table to the product folder for our data product. So perhaps this is where we want to keep track of the metadata if we want to keep our metadata maintenance directly connected to our data production. So let's look at this processing.rmd file again, but this time with a little bit more mindfulness about generating metadata for potential future users. If I go back to the top of this file, I want to set up something that allows me to pass the metadata on. Right now I'm running this processing script. I'm going to be generating some metadata as part of that, and I needed a place to put that metadata to allow me to save it for then putting into the report that is ultimately generated by this metadata.rmd file. So at the top of this script, I'm going to start by adding a variable that I call metadata. And I need a data structure, in this case, a really flexible data structure that's going to allow me to keep information that I can then save and then pass on to a future script. Now, I've done this before with lists in this class, but what I'm going to use this time is an environment. Now, we've talked about the fact that you have a global environment that's holding all the variables that you're using. That's what shows up over here in this window in the upper right. Well, it turns out you can have environments within environments, and you can have as many environments as you want. You can create your own environments. So I'm going to create my own environment called a new.env. You're using the function called new.env. This creates a new environment. I'm not giving it any arguments, so by default, where this environment will be located is in the global environment. So you can have environments with environments in them. And environments work a little bit like named lists, in that you can use the $ operator to specify variables in an environment, but they don't have any order associated with them. There's no indices, numbered indices. You can only get at elements of an environment using the name of that element. So we're going to create a new environment called metadata. Let me go ahead and run this line of code. I'm going to hit Control Enter while I have a cursor on that code. That automatically runs that line. You can see it shows up down here in the console. And now I have an environment in my global environment called metadata, and I can put whatever I want in metadata as variables, just as I would put variables in my global environment. It works the same way. It's just now they're all going to be contained in this environment. And that just gives me the availability to take a collection of variables that I want to keep for future use and save them all in this environment and pick them up later in a later script. Now, as I work into this file, I want to rethink how I organize my outline here because I've done a few things for the same particular deployment. I'm reading some data, I'm visualizing that data, and then I'm writing a data table. And so far, I've just called things like table data and visualization in my product. And that really lacks some potentially useful metadata about, where does this data come from? In particular, if this data product were a little more complex, I probably would have more than one deployment in the same data product. So right now we're just talking about one site, but what if I had instruments out at 3 sites like we did for this particular project? I might want to add some metadata to the file names that make sure it's clear which data I'm talking about for this data table and which data I'm talking about for this visualization. So let's think about maybe a better way to organize our processing script in order for doing that. So I am going to add a new first level header here for a particular deployment. And this deployment is called par ll par 01. That's the code name for the site where this instrument was deployed. Well, maybe the site name is a really useful thing to key off of for metadata describing all of my data files. And maybe I want to use the same name over and over again for the naming of the files that eventually end up in the product. Well, if that's the case, I'd rather set up code that makes it so that I've only defined that in one place, so that if I ever want to change it, I can change it in one place, and then it will change everywhere in whatever my code controls. So I'm going to create a variable here that I call dep name, short for deployment name. And I am going to put this string par or par underscore llpar01. And then I'm going to substitute this with the variable name. And therefore, if I change the name here, it will automatically change in this heading, and it will automatically change anywhere else I use this deployment name in defining things like file names for my data product. Okay, so I'm all set up to talk about this deployment. Now I want to change the levels of headers here because I'm going to be reading the data for this deployment. I'm going to be visualizing the data for this deployment. I'm going to be writing the data table for this deployment. Now at the top of this code that's creating the table, here's where we might want to start defining some of our metadata. So we want to add a variable to this metadata environment. And for environments, you use a $ operator, just like you do for named lists. And the name of the variable we want to put in metadata, in this case, I've called it table. This is the metadata about the data table. So I'm just going to call it table. And as I have done before, I still need several different elements describing this table. So I'm going to use, in this case, I'm going to use a list to list out those different things. I could use another environment here, but I'm just going to go ahead and use a list. It'll work either way. And I have 3 different elements I want to add here. There's going to be a path, and that's going to be an argument that's specifying the path element for this list, a format element, and finally a description element. So I'm just typing this in now just to remind myself that I want these 3 elements, but I haven't actually defined the values yet. So this is going to be a list with 3 elements: path, format, and description. Now the path is going to be the actual path to the file relative to the data product. And here it's going to be a character string, but here is where I want to use that deployment name that I had before to make sure that the name of the table takes on the deployment name as part of the file name. So I'm going to use paste 0 to concatenate strings together without any spaces in between the strings. And it's going to start with a path. In this case, it's going to be going to, oops, I don't think I have my working directory set up, right? I don't, so I need to go to my knitter settings, go to knit directory and say current working directory, because I want to work from my root. There we go. Now I've got the pipeline folders here. And it's the product folder ultimately where I'm going to put this table, where I'm going to write this table. And then after product, I need a slash, and then I need to give the name of the file. In this case, I'm going to start that name with the deployment name. So recall, I defined that way up here, right here. And I'm using it down here, and I'll be using it in several places. Now it'll be convenient, so if I ever want to change it, it'll change everywhere automatically. And then so I'm pasting a string together. I've got dot slash for underscore product slash to go into that directory, and the file name is going to start with a deployment name. And then after the deployment name, I'm going to put table, just to say that this is the table for this deployment. And it's a CSV file. It's a text file. It's comma delimited tabular data. So I'm going to call that a .csv file. So this is going to be the path to the location where the data table is going to go. The format is going to be some description of the file. Now this is where we get into different kinds of data types for files. And this is really important information for telling us something about how to read a particular file that we're providing as part of our data product. Now I'm going to go in to the current version of the product, and I'm going to open up this CSV file with an editor called Notepad++ that's available on Windows++. This is a really powerful coding editor. And one of the ways it's really useful is it will tell you under this encoding menu what kind of text file this is. There's actually more than one kind of text file. Now these days, more than likely, it's going to be UTF-8 is the name of the text file. So that's the kind of text file this is, and that .csv is just a hint at what is contained in the file. The .csv and the name of the file is not really telling you specifically the content of the file. The content of the file is what it is. This is just a hint. This extension on the file name is just a hint as what the file might contain. And that means this is a text file, but it's tabular data with commas in between the columns. That's what a CSV file is. So we've got this information about the file that we might want to give to a user to make sure they know what kind of file it is. So I'm going to say this is a UTF-8 text file with comma delimited tabular data. And finally, we need a description. Now this is going to take more than one line, so I'm going to go ahead and use paste 0 to paste together more than one line of text here so I don't have code that's too wide. And let's say this is a table of photosynthetically active radiation data. Now, when I'm typing in descriptions of tables like this, I don't like to use abbreviations that may not be well known. So I'm typing out photosynthetically active radiation data instead of putting in PAR. And this is collected at the Lower Louse Creek for deployment. And again, I'm going to use my dep name here. So I'm going to insert the specific deployment name that I'm talking about here, because if I had more than one site at Lower Louse Creek, then this site that's specified by LLPAR01, then I'd want to be able to use the same description, but with a different dep name. So table of photosynthetically active radiation data collected at Lower Louse Creek for deployment, and then the dep name is going to get inserted into this description for me. Okay, so I've got this metadata table defined. Then somewhere toward the end, I want to write this metadata. Whoops, spell correctly here. Can't type this morning. Okay, so I want to define the path I want to write this to. And in this case, this is the kind of thing that goes in incremental. This isn't really part of the data product. It's just data that I'm saving for use later. This is where I'm saving this metadata environment I've created. And I'm going to call it metadata.rdata. And then I'm going to use save RDS. The object I want to save is my metadata environment. And the file I want to save it to is this path that I've just defined. And then we probably want to put something in the report to let us know that this happened. So I'm going to say incremental, if I could spell. And I like to italicize whenever I'm putting a path in. And that's why I define this path as a separate variable, so I could put the path in the report. So I'm saying the incremental metadata is being written to our data file, and then the path that I defined up here, that's the same path I used to actually write the file. So that means my metadata here in this description is inherently tied to the code that's actually doing the work. So if I don't have any bugs, I can go back to my protocol folder here and go to my processing.r, and I can rerun this. Now, a few things should be different here. If I go to my product, oh, I have not changed the file name. Oh, I did not change the file name yet. So let's go back to processing. Here we go. I define the metadata with a new path, but the actual code that's writing the table, I did not change yet. So here is where I'm writing the table. Here's the table I'm writing out, and here's the path I'm writing out to. I'm no longer using this path, so I need to get rid of this path. What I want to use is my metadata table path. So recall I set up the path right here to go to product, and then I have a new file name that I'm writing to rather than the old file name. What I forgot to do is substitute the file I'm writing the actual data table to in my code with that data that I defined above. So that should take care of that. Let's try this one more time. Let's refresh our product directory. Now we have a new name for our table. So this table data was last written at 11:23. That one's never going to get it written anymore because that's what it used to be called. I'm going to go ahead and delete that so it's not just sitting around. And this is now the new name for our data table that includes some metadata about the site of the deployment or the deployment code. Now it's still the same data, it's just got a new file name. Also, if we look in our incremental folder, we should see this metadata.r data where that metadata is getting saved. Finally, we can go to our processing notes. Remember, this is our processing script, and it's getting rendered to the processing notes in the incremental. We can open up this web page in a web browser, and now you can see underneath write incremental metadata, we see incremental data written to our data file and the metadata, that's new. Now we have write table comma delimited title, and this is actually using an old, so we've still got a little bit of a bug here in our R Markdown. We're almost there. We're still using path here, and we just deleted what path was, so it's still using the path when it was writing the visualization. So that's why we now are seeing the visualization file here instead of the data table. So we fixed the path here, but we didn't fix it in what was sent to the report. So I just need to replace this path with the same metadata table path. And while we're at it, perhaps we want to go ahead and kick out more of the metadata here than just the path. So we've got a comma delimited data. And maybe we want to go ahead and into our report, pick out the format that we defined. Let me double check metadata $table format. Okay. And our file description for the description element. We will render our markdown one more time here. Now, under write table, we have a comma delimited table, written to text file, and we've got the correct path now. We have a file format, and this is what we put in for the file format, UTF text file with comma delimited tabular data. And we have the description, table of photosynthetically active radiation data, collected at the lower Allows Creek for deployment, and it's inserted that deployment ID. So let's look at our model through the Easy EML editor from EDI and think a little bit about what we've done so far in terms of describing our data tables and what EDI requires. So under data tables, you can see that we can add tables. Remember, this is a blank set of metadata, so it doesn't contain anything. So just to see what kind of information they want, I'm going to add a data table from scratch. And you can see the required elements are things like the name, description, and file name, things that we've been talking about as the metadata that we're providing. Also, there have been things we're providing to make sure the user can use it. Like we've said, well, it's a UTF-8 text file and it's a comma delimited text file, meaning the columns of the tabular data are delimited by commas. There's some other required things here, but these are things that can be determined when you upload the file automatically in terms of the file size, a checksum, which is a checksum generated from the file that makes it easy to see if you're getting the original file or not, the number of records, which is the number of rows in the table. These things can all be automatically determined by looking at the file as opposed to something that you necessarily need to provide. Now, the one thing we haven't provided yet is information about the columns. And this is one of the more important elements of describing any sort of tabular data in a data product in terms of the ability to understand what every column is in every table that's provided in the data product. And through the EasyML interface, here's where you provide that information. We will get to setting up that information in the R Markdown in the next video.